Some historians have calculated that the average lifespan of a pilot in action during World War I was about 10 weeks. And during 1917, it was estimated that a British Royal Flying Corps pilot could expect to survive only 10 to 15 days. And some veteran pilots of World War I even started calling themselves the 20-minute club, because during 1916 and 1917, the life expectancy of a pilot was only 20 minutes. Any way you slice it, being a pilot during World War I was a challenging vocation. On today's episode of Revealing History, we delve into the hazardous and brutal existence of a World War I pilot. Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm your host, Dennis Gill, and I appreciate the fact that you're here today. Being a pilot during World War I was an incredibly dangerous and often short-lived experience. It makes sense, though, considering that at the time the war began, it had barely been a decade since the Wright brothers had made their first successful flight. Yes, aircraft had been used in combat prior to World War I, specifically in Libya in 1911 by the Italians, but this war was the first time that airplanes were used in combat on such a grand scale. So the aircraft designers, builders, military commanders, and the pilots themselves were still trying to figure things out. And as for the pilots, they were trying to figure things out at the same time they were being shot at. I have no doubt that it was an exciting time to be an aviator, but it was also a dangerous time. Let's consider all the challenges posed to a World War I pilot. First and foremost, the aircraft they flew were primitive by today's standards. Again, aviation was in its infancy, and early World War I planes were fragile, unstable, and prone to mechanical failures. Today, it takes many years, even decades, to design, test, and build a new aircraft. And during the early part of the 20th century, a new aircraft was designed, and within weeks, it was built and put into action. And sure, they worked out the bugs, but they did it during combat. And here's something that blew my mind when I heard it. Some United States pilot trainees were required to build their own planes. According to one account of a World War I pilot, their Curtiss JN-4 Jenny came in parts in crates, which they in turn had to assemble. And sometimes the parts wouldn't even line up properly, so they'd have to take a file and modify them to fit. I guess if it fell apart in the air, the pilot had nobody to blame but himself. And fortunately, Jennies were mostly used for training and not for combat. Oh, and since we are on the topic of training, it was for the most part inadequate. According to W. Roland Ding, a test pilot for the Blackburn Company, he gained his pilot's license in just 3 hours. And American pilots only received about 140 hours of flight training before going into combat. And many of the instructors didn't have much more flight time than their students. And once the young pilots made it over to Europe, they didn't find that the aircraft they were given to fly were much better than the Jennies they had trained on. Early World War I planes were fragile, unstable, and prone to mechanical failures. And pilots often had to deal with an aircraft falling apart or engines falling out. The airframes were usually made of wood, and the wings and fuselage were often covered with fabric, usually linen or cotton, which was treated with a tightening and waterproofing agent. And because wood and fabric burn rather easily, fire was one of the pilot's biggest fears. Now, if you were in one of these airplanes flying straight and level, they were built just fine. But once the stress of combat was applied, with all the maneuvering that occurs during a dogfight, that's when bad things could potentially occur. Take the British Sopwith Camel, for example, probably the most famous plane of the war. It is credited with taking out more German aircraft than any other Allied aircraft. But it was difficult to fly, which resulted in almost as many men killed learning to fly it than were killed in actual combat. According to a World War I pilot, the airplanes they flew were a tool just like any other, and seldom were they a reliable tool. The British de Havilland 4, or DH-4, was one plane that many pilots did not enjoy flying. It was given the nickname the Flying Casket because of its poor handling. The safety equipment for pilots during the war was rudimentary and primarily focused on protection from environmental elements that were the result of open cockpits, rather than combat hazards. hazards such as frostbite, hypothermia, and severe sunburn. Pilots wore flight suits, helmets, goggles, gloves, and boots to protect themselves from those hazards. One piece of equipment that would have been most helpful to a pilot flying a somewhat unreliable aircraft in combat was a parachute. But for most of the war, parachutes were not issued. Parachutes at that time were bulky and heavy, often weighing up to 40 pounds, and a pilot wearing one had a hard time fitting into the small cockpit of a World War I aircraft. And even if you had one, they proved to be unreliable. About 1/3 of the time, they didn't work as advertised, and the pilot would end up dying from the fall. That leaves a 66% chance of survival. I think I like those odds over not having one at all. But when compared to today's standards, a 66% chance of survival isn't very good. And using parachutes, if you had one, proved difficult. The cockpit was tight already, and adding a big bulky parachute made getting out a chore. And once the pilot did get out of the airplane, they would have to climb out onto the wing to jump while avoiding the biplane's rigging. And this would be done while the airplane was literally falling out of the sky, many times while on fire. Many pilots, whether they had a parachute or not, elected to bail out of their burning aircraft, choosing to die from the fall rather than the fire. And some military leaders, especially in allied nations, believed that parachutes would only encourage pilots to abandon their aircraft too readily. So the US and Britain officially did not allow their pilots to use parachutes for most of the war. And most of the parachutes that did get issued went out to observation balloon crews, as they were stationary targets and unable to evade enemy fire. Germany did begin equipping some of their pilots with parachutes in the mid-1918s, near the end of the war. And other nations also considered adopting them around this time. Seems like being a pilot during World War I was pretty dangerous. And we haven't even talked about the dangers from direct combat with the enemy. Early air combat was rudimentary, involving pilots exchanging pistol shots or even throwing grenades at each other. The first recorded air-to-air kill was achieved by ramming, which resulted in the death of both pilots involved. But as the war progressed, so did the technology and tactics employed by the pilots. The introduction of machine guns mounted on aircraft and the development of the synchronization gear that allowed guns to fire through the arc of the propeller revolutionized air combat. This made aircraft much more effective in dogfights, which became more common as the war progressed. The addition of machine guns also meant more things to worry about. Guns jamming was not uncommon, and unjamming a gun in the middle of a dogfight was particularly hazardous, as you might imagine. As we mentioned at the start of this video, the life expectancy of a pilot during World War I was sometimes measured in days. The dangers of aerial combat during the war created an atmosphere of fatalism among many pilots who lived with the constant knowledge that each mission could be their last. The psychological toll of watching friends and squad mates die regularly, combined with the intense stress of combat, led many pilots to burn out quickly or develop coping mechanisms like alcohol. And that, unfortunately, is the reality of war even today. Aerial combat during World War I was a perilous and dynamic aspect of the conflict, marked by rapid technological advancements and significant risks. Pilots faced numerous challenges, from mechanical failures to the constant threat of enemy fire, but their contributions had a profound impact on the course of the war. And it would also have a profound impact on future aerial combat. And the crews that flew bombing missions over Europe during World War II, like the pilots of the Great War, faced significant challenges and lived under the specter of death during every mission flown. The 100th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force suffered some of the heaviest losses of any unit of any service branch in any theater of war. After only 4 months, 77% of the original group became casualties of war. And those losses would earn the unit the ominous nickname, the Bloody 100th. To hear their fantastic story, click the screen now. And until we meet again, I'm Dennis Gill for Revealing History.